They are risking their lives on the rails and along the rivers to reach the United States. We'll discuss why so many migrants are making the harrowing journey now. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents processed more than 181,000 migrants who reached the southern border illegally in August. And that number is likely to be even higher for September. The surge in migration is among the high-level talks taking place in Mexico City. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and top Biden administration officials are meeting with the Mexican President, Manuel Lopez Obrador. We begin with this report from CGTN's Alistair Baverstock in Mexico City.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived here in Mexico City Wednesday night and held a joint meeting with the foreign ministers of Mexico, Colombia and Panama over the ongoing migration crisis that has seen 400,000 people cross the perilous Darien Gap between Colombia and Panama so far this year. It's a situation leading to big losses in trade between Mexico and the US, now mutually top trading partners, as border closures seek to fend off some of the more than 2 million undocumented migrant encounters at America's southern border, seen in each of the last 2 consecutive years. Mexican businesses report losing more than $1 billion just since mid-September. However, migration is not the only topic to be discussed during Blinken's 2-day visit. America's ongoing opioid crisis, which is claiming around 100,000 lives a year, and Mexico's role in curbing the influx of narcotics into the United States will be a major topic of discussion on Thursday. Those talks also including U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland.
En Estados Unidos sobre el papel de México.
The U.S. government's questioning of Mexico's halting or mitigating the flow of narcotics into North America has received only erratic responses from Mexico's government. But we must also see a wider debate within the U.S. around public health, regulation, and consumption of fentanyl as a major contributor to poverty and marginalization. It's a subject which needs attention on both sides of the border.
En ambos lados de la frontera, en Estados Unidos y en México.
Discussions between the two countries over the flow of illicit products over their shared border go both ways. While narcotics flow north into the US, illegal firearms flow south into Mexico, leading to a security situation officials here say contributes to more than 30,000 murders in this country a year. US-Mexico relations are currently in a difficult place, with both countries facing presidential elections next year. Some US Republican candidates have even suggested military force being used against Mexican drug cartels. However, as the two countries' top officials meet, they will hope to smooth out some of these tensions in a relationship that is increasingly interdependent. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
For more now on the migration crisis, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Austin, Texas is Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. Kate is an immigration attorney. From Beijing, Benjamin Norton is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report. From Phoenix, Rafael Carranza is an immigration issues reporter for the Arizona Republic newspaper. And Ariel Ruiz Soto is a senior policy analyst with the Migration Policy Institute in Sacramento, California. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Ariel, let me start with you. The Mexican President, Lopez Obrador, as we've been reporting, has been holding a meeting with the visiting United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Lopez Obrador says there are up to 10,000 migrants heading to the United States border each day. What's behind this massive exodus to the border right now?
Thank you. It's good to be with you. The reason that more migrants are coming to the US-Mexico border, at least were coming in September and in August, has 3 parts. The first part is that there's been a continuing increasing flow of migrants, mainly from Venezuela, but also Cuba and Ecuador and Colombia, traveling through the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia. and making slowly their way to the United States-Mexico border. The second flow is of people who were waiting in Mexico to try to understand the effect of Biden administration's policies on migration and are now also coming up to the border at the same time. The third aspect of this flow is Mexican nationals, especially families and children who have been displaced due to violence in certain states in the country and are also now coming to some parts of the border combined. So these three factors are what's leading to the larger number of flows that we've seen, and numbers indicate that in September we'll be seeing similarly highly elevated levels of arrivals at the border.
Right, Ariel, and would it be fair to say then that, relatively speaking, the Biden administration has made it somewhat easier for migrants to cross the border?
It's difficult to pinpoint what has been the decision of how migrants arrive to the border. What is clear is that there's been an increasing number of migrants arriving at ports of entry through the CBP-1 application. It's still not enough for the number of people that are trying to enter the United States, but there has been month-to-month increases in that orderly flow. Between ports of entry is usually where more of the focus has been. And in that particular flow, we've seen more families and children whom ICE and other agencies, including Border Patrol, do not have the capacity to detain or to house for very long time, meaning that many of those families are then released into the United States and then go to cities and places across the United States to do that. But it's difficult to say that it's because of the policies. Rather, the composition has had bigger effects into who is arriving and what the numbers are coming to the border for.
Rafael, we've had some news in the past 24 hours. The Biden administration now saying that it will expand a border wall in southern Texas. The Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, says he's disappointed with that decision by the Biden administration. This new section of the wall will be built in the Rio Grande Valley, where there have been about 245,000 illegal crossings just this year. Do you think the wall will have any impact? Will it act as any kind of deterrent on more people coming to the border?
Well, to be clear, the Biden administration has came out and said immediately after the news came out that this is not something that the Biden administration itself is pushing, but rather it is a holdover in funding that remains from 2019 when, under former President Donald Trump, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, issued a massive number of contracts to build additional border barriers. And so Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, issued a statement earlier today saying that the new barriers, or the barriers that will be built in South Texas, that those are part of that 2019 funding, and even though they are against building additional barriers, because the money has not been rescinded, essentially those contracts have to be fulfilled. But as we've seen, repeatedly along other parts of the border, particularly here in Arizona, where I am, the construction of barriers, and there's been so many here in our part of the border, hasn't really done much to change the flows. You still have a lot of people who are crossing over the border. We've seen an increase in injuries because now these barriers are significantly taller than they were before. But then you also have more individuals who are seeking to cross through areas where you don't have barriers, perhaps a little bit more risky, more rough terrain, and that places them at greater risk. So the walls themselves, or the barriers that have been built over the past 4 years, have not done much to stem the flow, as we have seen, because of the record-breaking number of migrant encounters that we see month after month.
Kate, President Biden ended the construction of that border wall. Of course, as we heard, it was one of the big policy platforms for former President Donald Trump, but he ended that construction in 2021, saying at the time, and I'm quoting here, he said, "Building a massive wall that spans the entire southern border is not a serious policy solution." But now here he is talking about building this wall, and this is his explanation for what appears to be some kind of inconsistency. Let's listen to him.
I tried to get them to reappropriate, to redirect that money. They didn't, they wouldn't. And in the meantime, there's nothing under the law other than they have to use the money for what it was appropriated. I can't stop that.
Do you believe the border wall works?
No.
So the other thing that the president had to do, Kate, was that he had to waive something like more than 24 federal laws to now get this new section of the wall built. So what do you make of this? And how is this news being received in Texas?
Well, I'm sure it depends on who you ask. I mean, I think Rafael, explained this well. This is not a policy of Biden's that he is proposing and pushing. This is a holdover. I will say that, the Biden administration overall inherited a real mess when we're talking about border enforcement, in particular as it pertains to asylum seekers. We used to, for several decades, have a system where people who were fleeing danger and persecution in their countries could come to our border, they could present at the bridge, and they could say, I'm afraid of returning to my country, will you help me? And they would be screened. They would be put through a credible fear interview, and if they didn't qualify, they'd be sent home, and if they did, they would be allowed in to prepare for their asylum hearings. And the previous administration completely closed down the border, finally, using Title 42 after many attempts. That has been lifted as the COVID public health emergency ended in May. And so we're getting ourselves back to a system where we have an orderly, dignified way to process asylum seekers. The Biden administration has made, in my opinion, really slow progress on that front. We absolutely do not have anything like open borders or even a situation where all asylum seekers can come. But we do, as a nation, experience influxes due to political unrest in certain countries, like what's going on in Venezuela, like what's going on in Nicaragua, with, infrastructure collapses in countries. And that's just something that we weather as a nation. And I think it's important to note that this is the United States of America. We can process asylum seekers in an orderly way, and we don't have to believe that this is an emergency or that there's something overwhelming going on at the border.
Kate, just one point on the president saying that this is a holdover from the previous administration, that the money was appropriated at that time and it has to be used right now. At the same time, he still had to waive more than 24 laws to get this wall built. If he doesn't believe that the wall works, could he have just said, look, I'm not waiving these laws, so this wall can't be built?
Sure. I mean, here's the thing that I think about President Biden, and I'll just opine, as myself here. I think that both, we see this from many Democratic presidents. We saw this from Obama. We see pro-immigration policies come forth, and then we see border enforcement stuff happen. And these presidents, including President Biden, gets a lot of heat when he lifts Title 42. And in my opinion, probably sometimes they take actions to seem as if they are more tough on border enforcement. I don't know, to seem more balanced. And so my personal opinion, could Biden be doing more about really just sort of simplifying what's going on at the border, having a clear, less chaotic system, not doing things like facilitating wall building, et cetera? Yes, I think that would be much better at the end of the day. And I wish that we had seen more positive action from the Biden administration, because I think at the end of the day, what that would result in for all of us is more clarity and less chaos. Because what happens is when we have these shifting, changing, chaotic policies, people are themselves, migrants along the border, unclear about what is going to happen. And if you think about someone who has fled their country, they're desperate, they're living on the other side of the border, and they try to cross and they get caught and sent back immediately. They don't have a way to be screened, and they're facing danger themselves. Well, tomorrow they're going to try again. And that artificially inflates the numbers, and it makes us look as though we have these record high apprehensions, when in fact, if we would just have a screening mechanism in place and stick to it and stop with all the shifting policies and trying to appease people, then I think we'd be a lot cleaner and simpler than we are right now.
Ben, the Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, he blames this mass exodus of people to the border on U.S. sanctions against countries like Venezuela, like Cuba, and like Nicaragua, as well as the drug-related violence that we have been seeing in Ecuador. In fact, Lopez Obrador has been calling for something like an integrated plan to stem this exodus to the border. To what extent have U.S. policies been responsible for this?
Well, Lopez Obrador has a very good point. I mean, this is something that's almost never discussed in U.S. media outlets. The sanctions that the U.S. has imposed unilaterally in violation of international law against many of these countries. I think this is certainly an important factor, although we should look at a few different reasons behind migration to the United States. So one of the most significant increases in migration that we've seen in recent years is from Ecuador, which had been one of the safest countries in Latin America, but there have been a series of governments in recent years that have really cut state support, and they're linked to organized crime and mafia forces. And we've seen an explosion in violence in Ecuador, especially in prisons. This has led to a rise in drug-related incidents and a lot of people fleeing the country. Now, Ecuador happens to be a major U.S. ally, so we don't see them blamed, and they don't have a left-wing government, so we don't see them blamed in this kind of politicized way that a country like Cuba is. Haiti is also another country that has contributed a lot to a mass outward flow of immigrants. And in this case, again, many people are fleeing violence and instability. And historically, for the past few decades, a plurality of immigrants coming to the United States, undocumented immigrants, were coming largely from Central America, in particular the Northern Triangle countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which had some of the world's highest murder rates. We have seen a slight change in recent years, and I think sanctions certainly explain part of that, especially in the case of Cuba. This is a country that has been under illegal U.S. sanctions for more than 60 years. Every single year at the United Nations General Assembly, virtually every country on earth votes to condemn the U.S. embargo. And especially since the pandemic, tourism revenue dried up in Cuba, and the Trump administration imposed hundreds of new sanctions on Cuba, which the Biden administration has not lifted. Those sanctions have continued. This has made it very hard for Cuba to get access to foreign exchange, and because Cuba relies on importing food and importing energy, this has led to a rise in costs, which has only been made worse by the global inflation crisis and the war in Ukraine that has created more economic difficulties. In Venezuela, it's very similar with the illegal U.S. sanctions, which have really made it difficult for the country to export to get oil revenue and get access to foreign exchange, which has also fueled a lot of inflation. But I think another important factor that we should keep in mind is that there's an entire cottage industry. It's not even a cottage industry. There's a very big industry in Latin America built around people who exploit immigrants and who give the false impression that it's very easy to travel to the United States. So I lived in Nicaragua for several years. I was there just a few months ago. And I have friends who on WhatsApp have received messages from unknown numbers saying, we can help you travel to the United States if you pay us X, a few $100s. And there's this impression that is given, which of course is largely misleading, that because a Democrat is president in the United States, it's now just an open border, which is of course not true at all. In fact, under Obama, the Obama administration deported and removed more undocumented immigrants from the U.S. than any other presidential administration. But there's this entire industry built around giving the impression, and of course, Republicans, they play on this. They act as though under Biden there's an open border, which there isn't. And this leads to a lot of people who are misled, and they spend all this money, and they are often forced into very dangerous circumstances trying to cross the border. And a lot of people are making, human traffickers and other groups are making money off of this.
All right. Ariel, Ben mentioned Venezuela a moment ago. Let's look in a bit more detail about what's going on there. According to the United Nations, 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country in recent years. The United Nations says it's the largest displacement crisis in the world. More than 400,000 migrants have crossed the very dangerous, treacherous Darien Gap in Panama to get to the United States border. What does this tell us about conditions in Venezuela and the level of desperation among people?
Well, there's two key components and distinctions in here. One is that what we've seen so far has actually in part been migration of Venezuelans that were established in other countries like Ecuador, Chile, and other South American countries, Colombia included, for the reasons that were just mentioned. And so that's a key component of people coming to Mexico now. Of course, there's still very difficult conditions economically in Venezuela, different political repression for some groups in Venezuela too, that amplify and compound the other motivating factors like the pandemic, lack of access to food, to shelter, nutrition, that make it more difficult for those migrants or for people to see a prosperous future in that country. So you have those people who are now seeing that difficult livelihood and now seeing potentially opening some access to the United States, because there are some migrants that clearly are calling their family friends back home and saying that they've made it, even though it was very difficult, that they've made it, and so many of them do come because of that. But clearly, there's also Venezuelans living from other parts of the country, from other countries in South America, and we've seen those numbers take up every time these last few months, including people and children, for example, Venezuelans who were born in another country.
Kate, in September, the Biden administration granted temporary legal status to 420,000 Venezuelans who are already in the United States, which makes it easier for them to obtain work authorization. I mean, how significant is that, given that there are so many people here still who've crossed the border and who are still waiting for their paperwork to be processed?
It's a big help. The asylum system is really backlogged, and the rules about asylum are that once someone submits their application, they have to wait another 5 months before they can even request a work permit. And so it can be up to a year before an asylum seeker, which many Venezuelans are, can receive work permission. Whereas this temporary protected status is a status that a president, the executive branch of the U.S., can grant to certain people from a particular country whose country has suffered some sort of collapse. It could be, Ebola in Liberia. It could be an earthquake in Haiti. It could be a hurricane in El Salvador, or it could be political unrest in Venezuela. And TPS says to all of the people who are already here in the United States from that country, we are going to protect you from deportation and provide you with work permission while you're here. So Venezuelans who entered before July of this year can now get access to work permission much more quickly than they would through the asylum process. And there's, as you said, hundreds of thousands of more people who are eligible under this process.
Rafael, the huge influx of people, of course, is having a big impact on major cities in America. I mean, if you look at New York City, for instance, they're accommodating more than 61,000 migrants right now. In fact, the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, is in Mexico. He's traveling to Latin America, rather, and he's trying to combat disinformation about, what life would be like once migrants have crossed the border. And it gets to Ben Norton's point that there are these people who promise those who want to cross the border, a great life in the United States. And he's trying to dispel them of unrealistic expectations. Do you think this is going to have any impact?
Well, it certainly could, but I think, as Ariel mentioned, sometimes the word of mouth is kind of what drives a lot of migrants to come to the United States anyway. And so if people are able to make it here successfully and they pass along the word using WhatsApp or other, kind of networks to let their family or members or friends know, that is more than likely to encourage, more people to come. And then because they already have someone who has made it and is living in a certain part of the United States, that is also one of the main reasons why individuals go to a city like New York, for example, or Chicago, because they know people that are there that have established themselves there already. And so I think it's going to take a lot more than just a visit to be able to do that. But certainly it is, having a very, very serious consequences, not just in those cities in the interior of the country like New York, but also in border communities along the U.S.-Mexico border who are the first line, the first line or the place where the migrants are being released, oftentimes into the streets, other times to the care of nonprofits, and then they make their way to other parts of the country. But it is, a big problem at the moment, and a lot of concerns with kind of the capacity and whether the nonprofits and the local governments that have been, doing the brunt of this work, can handle any more, migrants coming in.
Ben, there are many politicians in the United States, especially in the United States Congress, who are blaming the drug abuse crisis in this country on migrants. They say migrants are actually smuggling drugs across the border. They're smuggling the starter chemicals for fentanyl into the country as well. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he also said that he's concerned about the fact that illegal weapons are being smuggled into the country, and these weapons end up in the hands of drug cartels inside the United States. The Mexican president, Lopez Obrador, he said for his part that U.S. politicians are actually using his country as a scapegoat. Is there anything to that?
It's absolutely right. We've seen, especially as elections come up, that many Republicans have essentially decided they want to campaign on calling for a war on Mexico. Donald Trump himself made comments suggesting that he does want to send special operations forces into Mexico. He's considered drone strikes on his southern neighbor. I mean, this is completely unacceptable. First of all, the Mexican government has made it very clear that it opposes this policy. It would consider it a violation of its sovereignty and therefore an invasion. But because, Republicans tend to try to throw red meat to their followers like this and scapegoat countries like Mexico and China, we've seen that it's become increasingly popular. Legislation has been proposed to call for U.S. military forces to unlawfully enter Mexico. Again, Mexico has said it doesn't want this. Now, another important point to keep in mind is that this is distracting from another key factor, which is the role that big pharmaceutical companies have played in this, in particular the Sackler family. This is a name that's become very well known. Some journalists have investigated this family from Purdue Pharma, which made many billions of dollars promoting a pain medication like OxyContin. And there actually have been dozens of lawsuits against Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family for basically paying doctors to overprescribe pain medication that many people in the United States got addicted to. And this led to the synthetic opioid crisis. And because this medicine was so expensive, when people got addicted to medicine like OxyContin and they could no longer get a prescription and they couldn't have insurance pay for it, they turned to heroin, and eventually they turned to fentanyl, which is significantly stronger than heroin. Right. This has been a significant factor in the opioid crisis. It's been largely from U.S. companies that have profited from this, from overprescribing medication and pressuring doctors to do the same. It was in their financial interest. So Mexico is simply, I mean, there are organized crime networks, but in many ways they're simply responding to the massive demand in the United States. Now, when we talk about the drug issue, it's always treated as an issue of supply, but we never talk about why there is so much demand. Right. You can't simply blame one side, and Mexico has pointed this out repeatedly. One other quick point is that in Mexico, you cannot buy guns. There is one store in Mexico where you can buy guns, which is a military store. It's heavily guarded. More than 99% of the guns in Mexico come from the United States. And once again, there is an entire industry that is making a lot of money in the United States that is also very linked to politics and lobbies a lot through the NRA. And they supply the guns that are used in organized crime violence in Mexico.
Kate, I've only got about 40 seconds left, but you were talking a moment ago about the huge backlog in processing migrants, those seeking asylum at the border. I mean, if we look at some numbers very quickly, in 2012, the U.S. had over 300,000 open cases. Now it's 2.5 million. I mean, do you see that changing in the near future?
Sure, it would be fairly simple. There's the issue of migrants being processed in and arriving in cities. And I just want to point out that historically migrants who have come in and sought asylum on their own make their way to live with their friends and family, and you don't see this overflow in cities like New York and Chicago. The reason that we're seeing that right now is because governors like Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis are busing migrants from where they are to New York City, to Chicago, and they're dumping them with the intention of creating chaos and political stunts. That is why we're seeing what we're seeing in the cities around the United States. As to the court system, we do have an overwhelming amount of immigrants who are in deportation proceedings. The simple solution to that is to cut out the migrants who are not who do not have criminal histories, who are not a concern and who are not a priority for deportation, but that would take some discernment on the part of the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.